leaders emerge in teams because there's a need to provide that structure. And what makes people effective in that situation and their leadership skills useful is they understand team dynamics. Right, so.
Thank you. Okay, so real quickly, a couple other things we put in your handout for you to think about this morning. This is, of course, from yesterday. Let me just highlight this again. Having a process strategy is very important. If you went into the meetings yesterday without a process strategy, you're probably more likely to muddle around and not necessarily get all the information needed. You'll always be ahead by virtue of structuring at the beginning, going in. Remember, most people have a sense of what they want to accomplish in a meeting, but they don't necessarily have a sense of how they're going to accomplish it. Thinking about that is going to put you miles ahead of other people. Another thing that I think is worth thinking about is we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about how to make sure people have the opportunity to talk in groups. One of the things that I think is also worth emphasizing is that when people start talking, the best way to make sure people remain engaged and continue talking is if they think somebody is listening to you. And so the reason I put these effective listening skills up here is because we want you to remember that it's not just important to be listening, it's important for you to show other people that you're listening. So if you're in a group and somebody is talking, you need to make sure that they understand you're paying attention and listening, because that's going to make them want to talk and share their ideas. It's going to make it more likely that if they have unique information, the group's going to be taking advantage of it. Another thing that we wanted to raise here is an interesting phenomenon in groups, which is that a lot of times groups flounder around. Maybe some of you experienced this in one of the groups you were in yesterday, where after about 20 minutes you realize, oh my gosh, we only have a couple of minutes left and we really haven't made very much progress, et cetera, et cetera. So we find that groups often flounder in somewhat disorganized ways for as much as half of their allocated time. And at that point, the realization hits them that they will not complete their task at their current rate of progress. So we wanted to share with you some insights about how to make sure you don't end up in a group that really kind of gets lost and flounders a little bit in terms of their time. And the idea is that a lot of times what will happen in a group is they won't realize that they don't have a structure until it's too late to put a structure in place. And one of the ways to make sure that you put a structure in place early enough is to have some early goals. Goals help you structure because they make you realize the rate of progress at which the group is moving. So even putting some intermediate goals in place, like for example in the exercise yesterday afternoon, you could have said, well, we want to make sure that by halfway we have at least the first 5 items ranked. We figured out what the best 5 items are going to be. What this would do is help you understand whether you are making good progress or not. So putting intermediate goals in place for a group helps you realize whether or not you are making good progress, and that can help you understand whether the structure you are using actually needs to be changed or not in time for changes in that structure to actually get you where you need to go. A lot of groups flounder around because they don't have a good structure, they don't have enough structure, and they don't realize it until it's too late. Putting intermediate goals in place will help you keep track of whether the structure you're using is getting you where you need to go, and if not, whether that structure needs to be changed. Okay, one last thing. I'm going to turn you over to Maggie, and she's going to tell you something that will be a good lead-in for our next session.
So, a lot of you have spoken about the issue of the dissenting voice, and how do we hear that dissenting voice? How can we get that dissenting voice heard? Because sometimes that dissenting voice is silent. And the question is, how do we get folks to actually voice their dissent? And so, one of the things, there was a study that was done by some colleagues of ours where they looked at the impact of a minority board member on a board of directors. So it's a very important, board in an organization, and there's a minority board member. Now, interestingly, they've got a very broad definition of minority. So they said, well, was the functional background of this individual different than the majority of the board? So it was one of expertise difference, or perhaps industry background. So this is a group, maybe this is a group of an automotive board, but there's a banker on it, right? So he would be a minority board, or she would be a minority board member. Maybe there's a faculty member. Maybe they put me on the board, and I have the background of education, my education PhD, and nobody has an education like that. That might be the criteria by which I'm a minority member. Or race and gender, the typical kind of demographic notions of minority. And what they did was, they looked at the impact of how influential those minority board members were. And what they found was, they found some interesting results. What they found was that minority board members actually were much more influential, not surprising, the more experience they had being a minority. So when you're oftentimes in a position of being a minority, you learn how to use that status. It also turned out that they were also more influential if people who were in the majority had experience on other boards being in the minority, if they were sensitive to the effects that a minority board member might be experiencing. And also the relationship between the minority board member and one of the majority board members. To the extent that that minority board member had a relationship with one of the majority board members, a personal relationship, that legitimated the voice of that minority board member. And so you can sort of see that there are a lot of ways in which you can have things that are independent of what you actually say that might make you more effective as a person who is different in a situation. And that difference may be your opinion, it may be your status, it may be your race, ethnicity, it might be your education or your background. So what we want to do is we're going to take about a 10-minute break. We're going to come back in and we're going to do a video case analysis of influence. And what we're going to start off with is, in this particular case, it's a jury decision making, sort of in the U.S. jury system. And you'll see as the story unfolds that there is one voice against 11. There are 12 members of the jury. One voice is saying not guilty. The other 11 say guilty. We're going to watch that process unfold and look and assess the ways in which that lone voice kind of influence tactics and strategies that he uses to change the minds of the other 11. So let's take a break, and let's be back here at 11:15.